All right, guys. Sorry about the little technical difficulty. Today we have Scott Looney with us. Scott Looney is with the Game Audio Institute, and he is here. He is running a school that offers lessons on how to use game audio in Unity with middleware. And game audio is a subject that's not really talked about a lot. Not really spoken of. As Scott kind of mentioned earlier, to me, he's like, programmers. How do programmers talk with audio engineers, and how do you guys converse with each other to create the best product? Um, Without a doubt, audio is one of the most essential parts of game development. Ignoring audio and just focusing in on gameplay is a recipe for doom. I'm glad to have Scott here. Scott, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and Game Audio Institute? Let's kind of put this in the right frame and let's start diving into this.
Sure. Yeah. So basically, the deal is that what we do is we provide lessons and materials to people who are interested in studying, learning more, and potentially getting jobs in the field of game audio. Um, so what we deal with is one of the issues that really that kind of made it important to sort of get into this whole thing was the fact that many times schools, if they were pursuing a game audio class, were doing so in an incredibly haphazard sort of way, where basically they would just take any game made by somebody in the game design department or maybe a nearby school that was making games and stuff like that, and then they would try and put audio in it. And then the idea would just be like whatever the person who programmed the program, however they planned the audio system or didn't plan the audio system, is what you would be stuck with, in order to deal with this sort of stuff. And we figured that what happened was, people would want like a consistent experience to sort of, get their training wheels underneath them so that they could get, confident about, how to implement audio in Unity. And then of course we started adding some classes in middleware. At the time we're mainly using fmod. We are eventually going to go over to some wise things because that's considered a more well-known middleware, although fmod and wise have both been around for a pretty long time, almost 2 decades at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, yeah, so that's the deal. And i I started getting into game audio as a result of basically the deal of being asked to write a class in game audio, and as a result of all the studying that I did, I managed to meet my friend Steve Horowitz, and we were very much at the time, we were dealing with things like in game audio, and at that time, what would happen would be you'd watch a YouTube video maybe of somebody who was in either a digital audio workstation like Pro Tools or whatever, or maybe they might be in the middleware, but they would be like sort of having their sound queued up, and they'd be like, well, let's imagine what it would be like in the game. And this is just about the same time that Unity sort of became more well known. And suddenly it was like, hey, wow, here's this game engine. It runs on a Mac, which was really rare at the time.
Mhm.
And by the way, you can put your sounds inside this game engine, and you can hear what it's supposed to sound like, when it's being triggered by the game, that kind of thing. So that's basically kind of how we got started in that respect. And that was the basic deal.
So, I I would love, because I'm sure, much like myself, there are people in this room who have no concept of the process of game audio. What is middleware? Is it background music? Is it sound
Yep.
effects? Do you sit in a studio with padded walls and that block out everything? I like there's no, I guess, grasp of reality yet.
Uh-huh.
So could you kind of walk us through with baby steps
Sure.
as far as the
So
develop? Yeah.
I'll just yeah. So the deal in this particular case is, one of the things that we have to tell the people who are doing this, and let me share my screen and I'll show you what I'm talking about.
Sure.
Um, the the deal in that particular case is, let's see.
I just made you co-host.
Oh, awesome, thanks. Uh, so Just getting all my screen real estate back in place again. All right. So the deal is that the first thing that we have to usually tell people who are dealing with this sort of thing is that we're dealing with people who've already dealt with all the sort of stuff. There's three big categories in most games. Okay. So that is going to be music, sound effects, and voiceover, basically. And the deal is that at that point, then you can have the main issue that we usually say, like if I've got 30 seconds to talk to somebody and say, I do game audio, how does that work or whatever like that? This is what I usually tell them. Okay. So what's happened is that if you get musicians and people who've been working in, say, film and television, stuff like that, they're suddenly dealing with a non-linear medium. Okay. A non-linear medium. Now, it's interactive in that respect. So what does that mean? Well, okay, if it's a linear medium, then what happens is that if you have let's say you're making a scary film, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And a scary film at like 13 minutes and 12 seconds, what happens is someone's going to go into the scary house and they're going to open the scary door and it's going to make the typical scary door sound, right? Right? So then the deal is that if you know when that is, and you're sitting here in your digital audio workstation, you can line it up at that specific exact time, and then you can mix all your sounds together, and then every single time you play it, it will always be in synchronization with the video, so you can automatically mix everything and you're good to go. In a game situation, as you well know from playing things like Silent Hill or whatever like that, you could decide not to go into the scary place. You can just wander around the front of the yard for an hour and a half and you never go in, right? So the idea ends up being is that the game has to be prepared for this possibility of anything happening. Well, how does that actually happen? Well, all of a sudden you've lost the connection to when something has happened. However, because you are programmers, you know exactly how something's going to happen, right? So in other words, if you're the person who's made the game, you know how the door is going to open because you've decided to make it happen either with an animation or a trigger or something like that. Player presses the button or something like that. So the deal is you replace that when with how. But that suddenly now means that every single element inside the game, all of the sound effects, all of the music, all of the voiceover cues, they all have to be triggered separately. Okay. And that means that you have to keep track of a bunch of assets. So a typical kind of workflow of a game audio person, especially if you're not dealing with middleware. In our industry, this is called throwing it over the fence. Throwing it over the fence means that basically they make the assets and you put them in the game, and then you give them a build, and then they give you some notes, and then you correct some things, and then you keep doing that until eventually you basically finish the game. Here, I'll give you a little. Did I? Oh no, that was back in middleware. Okay. So the deal in this particular case is that when sound designers is designing the sounds, they're going to bounce out and organize all the sounds so that they have them, divided up by whatever categories they're going to be in the game, and sometimes that can be a lot. I mean, anyone familiar with that game Limbo?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that game has 40 different foot sounds on 15 different surfaces for heel and toe on each foot.
Wow.
That's just the footsteps. That's, and it's an incredibly subtle game. It doesn't seem like it's got that many crazy weird sound effects, but just the foot sounds alone was, had to be like that. Anyway, so in this case, so bouncing out and organizing. Now, that means a couple of different things, but definitely it does mean naming your files appropriately so that they know, so that you, the programmer, know what to do with the files, right? You're not going to bounce them out like audio 1, audio 2, audio 3, audio 4, and then you're going to be sitting there, what the heck does that mean, So the deal in this particular case is they're going to bounce them out, they're going to organize them, you're going to trim and edit them, of course. You don't want any, silence in the front, silence in the back. All that stuff means resource usage, right? And so you don't want to use, too much resources. You're going to volume balance the files because, yes, you can potentially put them into a mixer and mix them that way, and you can do that, and it's totally fine. But the thing is it's best to kind of get it close to that balance that you need, and then all you need to do is just make a couple of little changes here and there. So volume balancing will be very important. Like, so for example, if you have a background ambience, you're not going to normalize that. In other words, you're not going to make that as high volume as possible. You're going to try to keep that as low volume as possible generally, because ambiences usually tend to be in the background. Obviously, you must make perfect loops. There should be no pops or clicks or things like that. If any audio person is handing you MP3s, hand them right back. Because basically MP3s are absolutely one of the worst things to do to get totally seamless looping directly. The reason why is because MP3 has actually been built in to be only frame based, not sample based, which means that essentially, if the sound does not actually come out to the boundary of a video frame, then it just fills in the rest of that frame with silence. And that's how come you get skips in MP3 files for loops. And then the last thing is called the asset list. And that's going to be pretty important, especially if you're working with a contractor or whatever. You might, manage this kind of stuff potentially with Jira or some other task management stuff. I don't know if you teach your kids about Jira and Trello and stuff like that.
We don't. I don't think we actually teach the Trello process in the course, but of course, it's kind of like one of the essentials to the workflow of every game company nowadays. With
because they just need some kind of task management software.
Yeah,
it all
exactly.
depends on their whatever you want to call it, company culture,
Yeah,
as
exactly.
to kind of what they like the best, whether they're doing a waterfall thing or they're doing like a scrum or whatever.
Exactly.
So the deal in this particular case is you have an audio assets list. It has like maybe a trigger, like when you're going to have that, this can be a million different things, but usually there's some kind of way of creating a file name that's going to let you know what is going on inside the game, in other words, and be able to do things like that. And then the idea is that then this is to keep them honest. Oftentimes game development can be a start and stop type process where, especially if you're an indie developer, they run out of money to pay the person. So you might suddenly go into dormancy for a while they come up with some more money to finish the game. And it's a good idea to, have some kind of asset list to kind of keep you on your toes and aware of what's been going on as far as like that kind of stuff. Yep. And you also have, the source management stuff is a whole nother thing. And it's definitely one of the things that is often not talked about with game audio people for sure. But anyway, so the deal is that they're going to have these kinds of assets, and then the idea is that then they bounce them out, and then you basically stick them in the game. Now, normally what happens? Let me see if I can find the pictures on Middleware. Yep, there it is. So normally what happens is that this is the typical sort of flow. They give you the assets, the sound files. This is the throwing it over the fence part. You put it in the game engine. You make a build, and then this whole 1, 2, 3 process goes over and over and over and over and over again until you basically just stop working on the game because you hit the deadline or something like that. Somebody actually who was a game developer said games are never released; they are merely abandoned. So at some point you just simply have to be like, because you can always keep polishing and whatever like that. In this case, the deal is it's okay. Maybe you at some point you have to release the game. So whether it's 100% ready or 99.8% ready.
That's why you got day one patches, man.
Yeah, exactly. Now you got patches and stuff and updates after that. Exactly. So anyway, so that's basically kind of how it goes into the game without middleware. And there are still companies that will not use middleware for one reason or another. Because sometimes it's tricky in terms of dealing with the source management. Sometimes it's tricky in terms of dealing with the licensing issue. Like the company makes some money, they don't want to pay the licensing fee for the middleware, or whatever like that. So these kinds of things can definitely happen. Now, in the case, so first of all, middleware. I mean, you probably know what middleware is in general, right? Right. In terms of like middleware like speed tree and stuff like that, right? It's supposed to make you do something. Essentially, the basic principle is something kind of like this. You've got a code base of some kind or another, right? you're the programmer. You're going to be dealing with the API and giving it calls and stuff like that. Your sound designer or your implementer, your technical sound designer, sometimes they call it, they're going to be dealing with some kind of user interface, a GUI-based editor of some kind or another. And the idea is that then, they're going to contribute to that code base by just, sending information from the editor. You basically then program the code base there, and then it all goes back and forth to the game engine, essentially. That's the idea. And what happens is that in a middleware-based setup, then basically the deal is you still have this communication, but the communication is for something called like hooks or parameters, okay? The idea being that basically, by a hook, it's basically just an event. Oftentimes an event that's hooked up to like an animation. But if you're doing like a Final Fantasy type game and you had an attack or something like that, and that animation attack would then trigger a hook. And then the hook would play the sound effect at the same time that the animation was happening, kind of like, right? A parameter is a little bit more what they call an adaptive thing. So I should mention a little bit about, I should probably give you a little background on that one. Adaptive and interactive. So adaptive basically means interactive is pretty easy. Interactive is just push a button, get a sound. Walk to a trigger, get a sound. Something like that. Adaptive audio, on the other hand, is let us join some aspect of the game structure to the sound, so that when that situation changes, the sound is going to change. Let's say one of the easiest ones that I can think of just right off the top of my head is Mario Brothers, right? Remember when you eat the mushroom, you get all big? And this happens to your jump sound. Your jump sound changes pitch because you're not a big giant guy. So there's that's a very slight difference. But you might have a situation of health, for example, affecting how high you can jump, and therefore the sound that's going to play when you do this. And interactive and adaptive are not like two sides. They're not like an on and off switch. It's like you can have varying amounts of this sort of stuff. So you can have like a sound that is 100% adaptive, or you can have a sound that is 100% interactive. Like the next one version of slightly adaptive sound would be, as you play the sound, it randomizes the sound effect. But you are the one that's triggering the sound, either walking or maybe firing a gun or something like that. But the idea is that so that is kind of what this enables a sound person to do, is to get all these kinds of behaviors. The adaptive quality would be like a parameter of some kind or another that you're tracking in the game, like, I don't know, fear or tension, or like if you have a racing game, would be the car speed would be a pretty obvious one. So like, in other words, the idea is that maybe the car speed, that at certain speeds it triggers certain kinds of pieces of music to happen, or maybe makes the engine rev higher or whatever. That's the idea, is that you would talk to your programmer or possibly your producer, somebody who knows what the structure of everything inside the game is, and you just sort of work on those ideas so that they can then work here in the middleware. And what they're going to do is then determine the sound behavior. And I can guarantee you that a sound person is going to know a lot more about how to make really cool things happen than you will most of the time, especially if you're not aware of audio. For example, probably one of the most common things that I've ever seen is a situation in which, the programmer is going to make their own audio engine or their own audio management system or whatever. And what will happen will be that in the game, you'll go from the menu music to the game, and you'll completely cut off the menu music and go straight to the game. And then they will send you a note saying, can you please make the menu music not cut off as soon as you go into the game? Because to you, that doesn't mean, whatever. I just loaded that scene and we load the other scene. That's not a big deal. As far as Unity is concerned, what you just did is you stopped the sound source that was playing in the menu scene, you loaded another scene, and now it's playing, that thing. And that seems fine to you, but it's not professional as far as like the feeling that an audience member gets. It's not polished. So middleware allows a little bit of this kind of stuff to be given, or maybe a lot of this stuff, to be given to the audio expert themselves. All you have to do is say, next scene, or you have a like an event called next scene, and in that case what happens is that the audio person has already made a situation where it's going to fade out the music and fade in the next music automatically, and you don't have to worry about anything. All you have to do is just have some code in there that says do this, at various times, and so that makes it much easier on you. Also, middleware can work with banks, and banks are great because what that means is you take a bunch of different sound data, whatever that is. It's going to be basically at one particular format, like either MP3 or OGG Vorbis, or or AAC or something like that. So in other words, all the files will be of one particular type, one particular sample rate, one particular bit depth, and really it's actually one big file. And then there's a bunch of metadata that basically tells it where to go look in the file to get the data it needs. But what does that mean for you? That means that you don't have to deal with individual sound files anymore. All you have to deal with are banks. So if you've got a big game, you might be looking at, say, 5 to 10 banks or something like that. Somewhat of a big game. It's very common, let's say, for like AAA games to say every level, all the environmental sounds would go into one bank for that level, especially if the levels are different per like environmentally speaking. So this is an example of kind of like what middleware can do, right? And up until fairly recently, maybe the last 3 or 4 years or so, this has kind of been the model that what happens, which means that if you're in a business and you're looking for an audio person, you're just looking for somebody who knows about middleware and how to make assets, basically, right? Now, the newer thing these days is now what has happened is that they're finding out that audio people are getting better at being able to do little lines of code.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so what happens is that you still have to have the communication. This gets a little confusing. They're still working in the middleware. They're going to send you the banks and the code to something like GitHub or Perforce. That's what Richard was just mentioning right here. Perforce and GitHub. And by the way, I'm going to tell you right now is that Perforce is one of the most, it's both a wonderful thing and the bane of every single audio person's existence, and possibly every game developer's existence, because its management scheme can be really wonky sometimes. And if you're not a good Perforce admin, you can do something like, I don't know, lock your entire company out of the game because you've decided to check out the game, because Perforce can let you do that. Anyway, so the deal is that you're dealing with source code here, and the programmer's going to merge your changes into the repository. And then then the audio person is going to get the code from the repository. We'll sync it back up and, put it back in the thing. And the whole cycle will continue until you finally, ship the game effectively. Mm-hmm. But the idea is that they're going to contribute code to them. Now, that means, of course, they need to be good at this because, of course, they could completely screw the pooch, right? They could totally, like, not put in a curly bracket at some point and all of a sudden your code's not going to compile, Mm-hmm. But the idea is that this is another thing that is now being asked by game companies of game audio people to be at least a little bit, capable of being able to put in little lines in code. They don't have to be full-on programmers. They just have to know where to look in the code to make that, particular event happen, essentially. Mm-hmm. So that's basically the deal. I mean, as far as that, there's many different kinds of middleware out there. So Fmod was probably one of the first. It's not the first. I think Miles Audio is one of the earliest ones. But Fmod Studio is available for Mac and PC, and it builds pretty well. They have a fairly relaxing license on their usage situation. I think they're up to 500,000 now. So it means, yeah.
Real quick. So can you explain what because I'm looking at the screen, I see something similar to an Audition or
it looks like a DAW, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I'm confused.
Yeah, it's not a DAW, definitely not. But it has a very linear look to it, whereas mm-hmm. Wise does not. But their basic operating principle is pretty much the same. The deal is, in this case, what Fmod is good at doing, and I mean, I could start up an Fmod thing, I suppose. The deal is, let's see if I can get Fmod going here. This is the latest. All right.
It sounds very similar to like what we do with sprite sheets, where instead of having single images, you stack them all into one gigantic image, and now you have 6 sheets to control the entire game that you're just pulling from. Is this similar to where instead of having individual tracks, you're literally just taking all the tracks that you want to use in your game, stacking them into a linear sequence, and then saying play at this point?
Well, it's not quite. It's not quite like that. I mean, yes, it is in the sense. Okay, I think, I think the analogy of bank to sprite sheet is reasonable. Like, in other words, the idea of a bank is that it contains all of the actual audio data you need. But the thing is that as the programmer, you don't even have to actually worry about where to go on that. In other words, all that is saved in the metadata of the actual bank itself and the event that uses that part of the bank effectively. So the idea ends up being is that that's all there. All you have to do is agree on what the name of the event is and what the range of the parameters that you're potentially going to be using is. For example, and that's a good one because, like, for example, let's say you happen to have this car speed and you've decided you want the car speed to be 0 to 1 float, right? But then they decide that they want it to be 1 to 1,000 or something like that. So now all of a sudden you have to, normalize their value in order for it to fit into your game, So it's important to know, like, to kind of be on the same page as far as, like, the ranges of your parameters and things like that. But yeah, anyway, all of that stuff, once you know those things though, then it's not too difficult to actually, like, trigger an event inside the game situation. Or to pass parameter values or things like that. Anyway, let me share, or additionally share, I should say. Hang on. New share. Okay, so here's an example of fmod. So that's fmod, right? It looks pretty basic. I'll give you some ideas here. It's footsteps. So the thing is that fmod has a bunch of different stuff. Let me give you the music. That'd probably be a good one. All right, this is a good one. There's different ways of representing this sort of stuff, and depending on how a person decides how to make sense of it, essentially, there is what's called the timeline, and there is also a parameter line. And you can put events on the parameter line or on the timeline. In this particular case, it's on the timeline. I've got this thing where it's going to have different levels of intensity. And when you go to these different levels of intensity, and this would be what you'd want to keep track of in the sense of inside the game, that this would be level 0, this would be level 1, and you just kind of keep going up onto those levels. And then the composer or sound designer determines what they're going to do with this stuff inside the middleware, essentially, right? That's the idea. They're going to determine all that stuff. All you have to do is determine when the game is going to change state in some way, right? Like, oh, we're fighting the enemy. Oh, now we're fighting several enemies. Oh, and now you've won or you've lost, that kind of thing. So, for example, I have an explore situation. Game starts out in explore. I'm going to turn down the master on this so I can talk a bit. So this is going to be like kind of spacey music, so it doesn't get in the way. And then at some point what ends up happening is that we're going to get into the next level of tension when the enemy finds you. So it's going to make a transition, and now it's going to start increasing in intensity. Okay? And you see what happened is it just automatically jumped over to that point, right? And now it's playing this section. And now what happens is if I do this again, so now we're battling the enemy. And now let's say it gets even more intense. Maybe you go to lower health. Right? And then there's going to be an outcome. Did you win? Okay, you win. Okay, so that's basically like the idea, and then maybe you might go back to the empty, or you might go back to the explore, or something like that. Buy once, cry once. Anyway, so and I'll definitely get into some questions. There's some very good questions. Richard's got a really good question saying, how does the C# connect to that, right? In other words, how does the code actually connect to that? That's pretty easy to do. We actually do have, I did actually write a thing on that. Let's see what I was, the deal is that we have, let's see if I can find the TPS version. And I'll share this briefly with you. So the deal in that particular case is that there's going to be mechanics, and you have to learn, and this is what we teach our students, obviously, is the mechanics. What does being in battle mean? Like, in other words, what triggers the battle mode? What triggers the fact that the enemy is fighting you? Let's just say if it was a really easy thing like something like Shadow of the Colossus, right? In the case of Shadow of the Colossus, you might have a situation in which you walk into the boss's, room, right? And then all of a sudden it's going to play the music because you walked right into a trigger area. That's the area where you're going to find the monster. Then the exciting music happens. In this particular case, the game is taking place on a ship, and the idea, or on like a space freighter or whatever, and you might find the enemy in any place on the ship. So the idea was like, okay, well, wherever we're encountering, how do we measure being fighting? Okay, well, maybe the enemy's shooting at you, or maybe you take damage, or maybe both of those things have to happen. And then in that case, we are in the game. So let me just show you what the deal is. For that, we have a music manager that we made for this thing. Go and find that. Is it new music manager? Yeah, I think so. All right, so then I will share this in a second here. Share this one. Oops, sorry. I wanted to do all of them. So let me just see that one and this one and that one, I guess. Okay, share 3. All right. So let me show you the script. All right. So that's come up to the front. You see that? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as you can see, what happens is that we have all the different, namespaces that we have, and in this particular case, the person that was working on this actually created their own namespace for everything, so that they could kind of more easily, address the objects in there. In the case of, actually, this is the wise one. Ooh, okay. It's not quite the same, but so I was looking at the Fmod one. So this is slightly the wrong version. But anyway, the basic principle is still the same. So in other words, it doesn't actually matter what middleware we're really using, other than just the names of the things that we're doing, that kind of thing. So in this particular case, what it does is you have to create a public wise event, and we just call it these particular things. And by public, of course, that means that they're exposed to the inspector, right? So you can just drag over things from your project over there, and you can then change the event that you need to. In this particular case, that can be the job of the implementer to do that, right? In other words, they can be inside the Unity project and they can do all this work, right? The idea. So what happens is we start out at a particular point. Some of these things this is somewhat crufty code at the moment, but basically we have different kinds of situations. We look at situations of whether we have certain amount of active enemies and whether they're low health or not. Then we're going to go to this particular mode, And so when we call that particular void, it's very going to be pretty simple. We're going to say public void set intensity parameter. And whatever the parameter value we want to set, that's going to basically determine what the music's going to do, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a very small example of how we can handle music in this particular case. So, and this is going to have to go back and forth, right? It's just, because you have to figure out what the best way that music is going to get triggered, and you may not dial in immediately. That might take an iterative process of a couple of weeks or even a month. It depends on how long your game development cycle is, right? But it might take a while before you kind of find the right combination of things that's going to result in a nice, smooth musical experience. And you're not going to have like sudden weird shifts or something like that don't make any sense. You might have to deal with situations in which if an action is happening for a certain particular time, that's going to be the trigger to actually do it. In other words, if you briefly, encounter your enemy or something like that, then that shouldn't just automatically trigger the enemy found mode. It has to be like, oh, you've actually stayed in the enemy area for a while. Now we'll trigger enemy found mode. There's a million different ways to do this because, of course, there's a million different games. So we have a million different ways of being able to cut the cake and look at it differently. So does the middleware let you create the sequence and then just trigger it through code? Yes. Middleware can. In fact, one of the things that I like to say about the middleware situation is basically the deal is that that it's kind of like it separates the logic into two parts, and one part is the game's logic, and the other part is logic that the audio person can create themselves. Like, in other words, they can make various kinds of things happen either in sequence or randomly. And of course, this can all be done with Unity Audio as well. That it's not impossible to do it that way. Just it's more work, right? Whereas in middleware, it's kind of already done for you. Especially if you find somebody who's good with the middleware, they can actually create those sound behaviors, and all you have to do is say make event happen. Maybe make event happen with this parameter, make event happen with this parameter, right, or something like that. So that's why people tend to like middleware a lot, and it can make life easier, but it can also make life harder. It can. I mean, I will be the first to say that middleware is sometimes not always the answer to every single problem. Many times middleware people think that everything is just like a middleware shaped nail. And they have to use a hammer all the time, the middleware hammer to basically hit the nail. And that's not always the case. Sometimes the game is very, very simple. It doesn't require huge amounts of, crazy, exactly. It doesn't require heavy amounts of programming or whatever like that, and to get a good result. Yeah. So anyway, that's a very brief overview in a sense. We're down to a little bit less, not too much time, so it might be good to, if anyone's got questions and stuff like that. I mean, some of the other one was, what was the other one? Anthony was saying something about
Yeah, Anthony mentioned, is this a good tool for like an individual as a solo, or is this a better tool for a team of people working on a project?
It's an interesting thing. I think it can be used in either case. I mean, for sure, the deal is that if this, I mean, certainly not. I would say that you would have to you'd be hiring a solo person to do this, ideally to do the technical sound management, especially if that wasn't already your skill set, that kind of thing. But you don't necessarily have to have a big team. I don't think you could have very small teams to do this, and it would be fine. In fact, Fmod is probably better for small teams than it is for big, larger AAA type teams. Wise is a little bit better for the big teams, because what happens is that you can actually split out the duties of, for example, you can actually have somebody work on what they call a work unit. And you can assign any number of things to a work unit. So that means but a work unit is an actual asset that you check in and check out. So that means you can assign that to one of the developers or one of the implementers and not touch the rest of the stuff, And then the other people can work on their own halves of stuff. Fmod's okay with that, but was not originally meant to do it that way. It was meant to be sort of solo kind of oriented to some extent. But and generally now how the market has broken down is that Wise is used extensively for the AAA world, and not so much, and not as much for the indie and sort of small developer sizes, whereas Fmod tends to be used for the small developer sizes. Although the thing is that there is some crossover, because Fmod does very good sound designs over linear linear sort of parameter ranges, whereas Wise, it's just visually not as obvious that you can do that. So there are just things that some of the middlewares do that other ones not as good at doing, essentially.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if that helps at all.
No, no, no. I find it fascinating because I mean, I could see something like this done in script, but it just seems like it cuts right to that, point in your timeline. But when you're playing this back, it feels like it's just waiting for a certain beat and then it cuts over to the next sequence
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
cleanly.
You can tell it to totally do that, and of course you can do this in Unity too, right? You can sit there and divide your if you're using do you guys know about audio settings.dsp time?
No, I don't know about
Oh, you
this.
don't know
I
that one.
know very little about audio.
I see. Okay. So the deal in this particular case is audio settings.dsp time is actually a separate double. It's a double. And what it is it basically gives you a sample accurate sort of timing mechanism. So you can use that to potentially time your events if you know exactly what the beat is, and therefore you would divide the beat into
Oh,
X
wow.
values, right, on a grid, and then you would wait until that particular grid moment to do that. Again, this is why middleware exists, is that so you don't have to worry about
Yeah,
making that
exactly.
kind of stuff happen. Because I'll tell you one thing right now, and I've done a bunch of sound projects directly in Unity Audio. In fact, actually, I'd say the Game Audio Institute has an equal amount of sound things using Unity Audio as it does using middleware. Um, and Unity Audio is absolutely horrifically bad for very, very tight musical timing,
Mhm.
especially if you're going to do procedural audio. So, in other words, if you're doing like this, and I'm going to trigger an event that's happening like every single time, like a drum beat or something like that, Unity is absolutely horrible for that stuff. You can kind of get along with like, okay, here's this long clip of several bars, and now we can like place another clip by scheduling the event, scheduling the audio a little bit in advance and everything. Again, hooked up to the sample clock, the sample rate clock, and you can basically get things to go that way. But it's not something that is super easy. And like I say, Unity's engine is essentially an old version of Fmod,
Mhm. Mhm.
but without all the fun, cool things that you can do with it. You're limited to whatever the audio team decide was important, essentially.
Gotcha, gotcha. When people go to your school and they leave with careers, like what do they have to show? Like what is it that they present? What is their official title? What when it comes to getting employed in the game industry? What
Right.
is it?
Well, okay. So in the Game Audio Institute, we're just barely starting into the course development sort of thing to some extent. We don't really have a program per se, but we do have courses of different kinds. The idea ends up being that what we're trying to do is make sure that we've given them the skills that they need in order to be able to do sound for games at a professional level, essentially. So the deal is that and we're teaching them all about middleware, but we're also teaching them because I can tell you right now, you can find all kinds of people who have their 101 and their 102 Wise certification. I'm seeing it all over LinkedIn, well, at least in my feed, right? Because I've got lots of audio people in my connections. So oh yeah, I'm super proud I got this 101 certification or 102 certification, and it's great. But the thing is that they ended up not knowing at all how any of those sounds are actually triggered in the game. So
Mhm.
that's what we do. We are really, really focused on that idea, putting the whole thing in context and having students really understand that understanding the game structure is absolutely vital to what they can do in the middleware. They cannot solve very many problems at all, really, with middleware as
Mhm.
far as how the sound is triggered. They can make, oh well, this will be random, or this will be sequential, or this will fade in, or this will fade out. That's fine, but they can't necessarily suddenly speed up footsteps when footsteps are going at a particular rate of speed, right? They need to talk to the programmer and say, can you make this guy move faster? That way my footsteps will play faster, that kind of thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
So the idea is, I think we give these people like the tools that they need, and they do have to kind of go on their own and do their own thing. But it's been a proven thing. We've got several students that are now working at AAA game companies. We've got one working at Riot. We've got one working at Alchemy Labs, the ones who did the Vacation Simulator and Job Simulator. We've got somebody working at Tencent that I know of. We've got somebody working at EA, was it Salt Lake City, or was working at EA Salt Lake City? I'm not sure where he's working now. Various people. We've definitely seeded the industry with a few of our graduates, and I think we've given them the tools in order to be able to really do well in this particular field, for sure.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Is there and forgive me if I sound completely naive,
Uh-huh.
but I remember when I first got into this, there was this big talk about stereo and surround sound and all this other stuff. And for me, it's like I've always just piped it into the mixer. But is there something relevant to this in game development? The idea of this going from stereo to like a THX experience.
So you're talking about all the surround stuff, huh?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the surround stuff is really interesting. I mean, at that point, I would start saying, "Hey, go to our YouTube channel and watch my video on VR AR audio." It's a primer video that basically kind of, takes you through all the different things that people have been talking about. And what happens oftentimes is that people think, or people are led to believe, that VR audio for VR and AR is suddenly this totally, never before seen experience. You'll never, it's totally different and all this sort of stuff, and you'll have to get the right skills and all that other kind of stuff. And that's not really immediately true. I mean, I would say that right now, all that cool stuff about spatialized audio, that especially is common in VR and AR games, you can think of it as just like one more color on your audio palette, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a couple more colors on your audio palette. You do not have to use it just because it happens to be there. Even though it does achieve certain kinds of realism and that sort of stuff, and it's very useful for certain kinds of things, you have to weigh it against, does this work in the game? Does this work as the game's actual audio? Now, yeah, in the case of the mixer, the mixer can actually deal with spatialized audio as well as non-spatialized audio, depends on things, but generally, at least the two ones that I've dealt with, which is like Resonance Audio and Steam Audio, they both can use the Google the mixer in Unity to deal with that kind of stuff, and that's totally fine. But I think it's important to mention is that just because it's a VR or AR game does not mean you are automatically required to use HRTF spatialized audio or ambisonic audio. And there are definitely limitations. Like, for example, a lot of people might tell you how great ambisonic audio is. And it is, as long as you don't have to move anywhere in the game and all you do is rotate your head. Ambisonic audio will not track your head position at all. So you can't use it for any kind of 3D audio source that if you want somebody to get close to or further away from and have that actually happen. Can't be used. You can definitely use it for music. You can definitely use it for ambiences, like non-local ambiences, like say room tone or something like that. But you can't use it for anything else. So it's important to kind of understand these limitations. And even when you can use something like that in a game, does not mean that you will. I've actually been talking to people, the developers, the sound team that did the Vader Immortal series, right? And they were telling me all the things that they did. And they ended up actually not even using ambisonic audio at all. And I thought, wow, that's crazy. It's amazing. But no, they just found that ambisonic audio for them really was bad for their workflow. Like, it just didn't work for them as far as just applying it directly in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those kinds of situations where, so the deal is that, they just use what works for them. And it doesn't always mean that it has to be the latest, greatest, most amazing thing every single time, as a result.
Gotcha. Is there, looking at this specifically from an audio experience?
Yeah.
If I was to watch a let's play of a game that does this well, like you would say, this is who you should emulate.
Yeah.
Is there a particular game or developer that you should follow?
It's quite interesting that you should mention that, because I've actually been watching lots of playthroughs of Horizon Zero Forbidden West, which is a fantastic game, but I have to say that the audio definitely needs some work. I mean, maybe they'll fix it in patches and things like that, but many times there's some bad audio. Now, the one that I would say has got some of the best audio I've heard just recently, just like, like off the top of my head, uh, um, The Last of Us
Mhm.
has some of the most really well managed audio. And not only that, like they manage things like, because I mean, you have to understand that like when you have an open world games and you have like branching dialogue and things like that, how complex of an issue that is. It's like, okay, well, and then you have to have a priority of importance for those kinds of VOs. You have to be like, well, which VO is definitely going to get the nod if I have a bunch of different VOs. So Horizon Forbidden West often has situations in which the character is going to talk to herself all the time and then also potentially will interact with people in the open world. Guess what happens? The VOs often overlap,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
because again, the management system is super, super complex. They might have not had enough time to really like dial that stuff in with the QA team before they had to release. But you can kind of tell the difference after a while, like, okay, yeah, I mean, and there are some times where like some character will be like saying their intro dialogue and their intro dialogue to the character is like kind of really low in volume. And then they get into their actual story that they tell and that's at better volume. So there's definitely some bugs in that, but Last of Us for sure. I watched some gameplay of that and, I'm really glad that I did because I didn't want to watch it because it was a horror game because they would show all these pictures of the clickers and I was like, no, nightmare fuel. No, thank you. But I did actually watch a little bit of it because I was having to do some stuff for San Francisco State. And yeah, they have some fantastic sound in that game.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
So overall, it's the Game Audio Institute is not about taking celery and cracking it to make a bone sound effects or playing your own music. It's about being a Unity developer who specializes in middleware and your Unity game and how you can plug in directly to actually assist a team in
Or in
developing their
between
game
or in
process.
between in between the two. For
Mhm.
for for me, here's the thing. When you're making sounds for games, you're largely using the same exact techniques that you use for making sounds for film or television.
Mhm.
Pretty much almost, you might make more examples of it because you get randomized sound effects and things like that. But you're basically using the same sort of technique. So again, we don't concentrate so much on the sound design. I mean, again, when we were grading our students in our schools and stuff like that, because I do teach at other schools around there and have students in that particular case. But in those particular cases, we look at the stuff and we basically like, we do want to basically do grade them from an artistic standpoint. Did it fit the overall feeling of the game and that sort of thing? But at the same time, if I'm gonna like let something slip, I'll let the artistic slip a little bit, but I will not let the implementation slip. Like that has to be right on, you know.
Mhm.
So because
Excellent.
that's the one thing that is different about game audio from audio for film or television. There's a
Mhm.
million different YouTube videos they can watch on how to design cool sound effects. There's not as many videos on how to implement them in the game in a consistent kind of way.
Gotcha, gotcha. And can you direct us to resources that we should
Absolutely.
look at to
Absolutely.
learn more about this?
Yes. So in this particular case, I will paste this for everybody here. This is our website, gameaudioinstitute.com. It's pretty much going to have just about everything that we do. We do have our own Twitch channel as well. I don't know if we actually have a link to that here, so I could probably hit that too. The Twitch channel does not go live very often,
Mhm.
but we do have interviews and stuff like that. And that's over here. And I'll paste that as well. And I guess the thing is that I guess what I would say is that we have a course actually coming up in end of May, beginning of June, which is learning all about VR and AR inside Unity and how we do audio inside that. And I'm going to definitely break it up into. I mean, there's actually it's like an 8-week course, and we actually have 5 in-person Zoom meetings. And we give you all kinds of support. And you're also going to have practice implementing audio inside Unity using Steam Audio, which will include both spatialized and non-spatialized audio. And then we'll also talk about the actual concepts of spatialized audio things that are going to be that that people are talking about, and then how useful they are as far as that kind of stuff. And we're also going to cover all the different tool sets that people are using, some of the free ones mainly, like
Mhm.
Facebook 360 for movies and Steam Audio and Resonance Audio and all that other kind of stuff that people are occasionally mentioning and stuff out there. Um, and and if you feel like cool, like helping us in any way, we're always on the lookout for people who have some game design skills, who could make us cool levels. Ideally, the idea would be that we are looking for like a sort of vertical slice of a game situation that would be relatively simple to do in a few weeks time, kind of thing. We've done really simple things like, I can just if I can share the screen for the website here. And in the website we have school, we have game lessons, and we have courses. We have game lessons. The game lessons are basically the things that we do with Unity. So we have these particular things. So again, these are more like Unity audio, but we do have some Fmod stuff basically, and we will have some Y stuff. It's just getting some bugs worked out right now. So these are the game lessons that you can get, and also we have courses. And we have courses that are, like I said, the one that we're doing right here, which is sort of like a virtual course, but not an 100% online course. But we do have online classes. This one right here, the first one, the GAI 101 Game Audio Introductory course, is probably not likely because I'm sure everyone knows about games and what they do. Although this does teach about how sound works in game audio from a very basic conceptual standpoint, kind of like what I was showing with some of my screens. And but there's also this course is the one you can actually take the same courses we're taking here for less money. That does all of these things, but does not include the Unity project. If you buy the Unity project, though, that would end up maybe basically saving you about half as much money as doing the in-person course, but then you don't get the in-person stuff as a result.
Gotcha.
But yeah, that's it.
Well,
Any
that was fantastic. I
Good.
really appreciate that, Scott.
Yeah, this is very enjoyable, and some nice questions on the side there. I have to say.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, everyone who tuned in, thank you for being a part of this. I'm going to hang out here with Scott for a couple more minutes, but everybody else, you're free to hop on off. Unless you have some questions, please pop it into the chat because, we're going to hang out for a little bit more. And other than that, thank you, Scott, and thank you for the Game Audio Institute for coming down there and representing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, man.